All right. Well, I think it's time to get started. My name is Tracy Ferdine. I'm the director of the Center for Global Environmental Education, and welcome to our second webinar, Waters to the Sea Stories, that we've hosted this year. We'll get started with a little bit of housekeeping to begin with, and then we'll get this evening on the way. Let's see, there we go. We're using the chat to introduce ourselves, to kind of share some ideas and interests. But if you have a specific question and answer, please put that into the Q&A spot of the webinar format. It's a little different than the regular Zoom. You probably use that, but that is a way that we're just moved to that this last time, and it seems to be working very well. Please keep your mic on mute. And what's really important to know is that the webinar is recorded, and you can go back to it. We tend to get it up in 2 weeks or so. And we have folks always are coming back to take a look at these as we go forward. Well, with that said, I'd like to kind of get started. Hamline University is the Minnesota's oldest university. It was founded in 1854, about the same time that the treaty that was signed in the Superior area. So I think that's an interesting feat that our university was there when that major land transaction occurred. So that's something to think about as we move forward. It is very well alive today. We're going to learn more about that as well when we look at the land acknowledgement. Our center has been around since 1996, 32 years, and we have a mission of fostering environmental literacy and stewardship in citizens of all ages. Now, we're really blessed to do this through 4 different areas. Professional development for teachers. We are hoping and planning on doing an institute up in the Duluth area with partners and collaborators. We create multimedia tools. If you were here last month, you know that we launched our Dark Sky, Northern Night Starry Skies program on WDSE. Tonight we're going to learn more about the K-12 curriculum that Chris has been leading and engaged with in the last year or so. And we have a community outreach program that we're excited to announce that the Adopt a Dream program is now being used and available through the city of Duluth. So those are some exciting things that we do. This integration of arts and science is a really important way for us to come together and engage. Tonight, we're coming together to learn about the Waters to the Sea stories. We have started this about 3 years ago, and it's been very successful. We're going to be engaged with Waters to the Sea stories, the St. Louis River area of concern. And we're very excited about this. So much is happening up on the North Shore of Lake Superior that we'll be talking about that a bit more tonight as well. But before we get going, I would like to read the land acknowledgement that Hamline has developed. And I'm really proud of this. I think they did a very good job, and I think it's a really thoughtful way of looking at the world. Hamline University acknowledges that the land on which we gather, referred to as Minnesota, is the traditional and unceded territory of the Dakota and Ojibwe. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Mokose, the land where waters reflect the skies. We pay respect to the citizens of not only those tribes, but others as well, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. Making this recognition expresses gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and honors the indigenous people who have been existing with and on the land from time immemorial. This long-standing history is significant as land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense or historical context. Colonialism, appropriation, or genocide have relevant real-time realities. We need to build mindfulness regarding the source of our present land privilege, understand the long-standing history from which it comes, and seek to reconcile our place within both. Hamline as an institution and community will hold itself accountable as an Indigenous partner by working stridently to amplify, address, and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to impact Indigenous people, individually, systemically, and structurally. I think it's one of the more focused land acknowledgements that I've heard, and I thought Hamline did a very nice job pulling that together. As we move forward, let's meet the folks who've helped pull this together. As I said, I'm the director of the center, been here for 27 years, and we have had some remarkable opportunities around the country. Sarah Robertson has been here over a decade and has got a larger role as the director, coordinator of our teachable professional development, coordinating our Waters of the Sea webinars, community outreach program administrator. And Chris Bennett has been around, worked for us about 10 years ago and came back this year and has done a great job in moving forward with the K-12 resources and implementation of the Adopt a Dream program, the Waters to the Sea, around the country. That is our team tonight. And I do want to give a shout out to John Shepard. John has been here for 26 years, and he is really the visionary that started the Waters to the Sea 25 years ago. Tonight, he cannot make it because he has offered his home to a Ukrainian family, a female teacher, and I think it's 7-year-old will be staying at his house and relocating to the United States. So it's really proud of his work with that, and he is meeting her for the first time in person tonight. So he thought he better attend to that. So I think we'd give him a pass on that. So thank you, John, for taking care of folks from around the world. But we're so happy to have Barb with us. And Barb and I met, maybe a decade ago when you were working with the Watershed Partners out of Rochester. So watching your career, watching what you've done some remarkable things as you've gone through your career and where you've ended up. So let me just talk about that. Barb Huberty is the St. Louis River Area of Concern Coordinator for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. She's been in this position since January 2018, helping to ensure that all local, state, federal, and tribal partners are working together to achieve delisting. Prior to arriving in Duluth, she served as the Director of Legislative Water Commission, helping its bipartisan members understand Minnesota's water issues. Before her state service, she was the Environmental Division Manager for Rochester Public Works Department and the Environmental Analyst for Olmsted County, focusing on permit compliance for their stormwater and solid waste programs, respectively. Before switching to environmental management, Barb spent 7 years teaching school in a variety of science subjects to students in grades 7 through 12 in 3 Minnesota districts. She's also had experiences working in the nonprofit and private business sectors. She has a degree in biology, secondary science education from the University of Minnesota. And during her free time, it sounds like she wouldn't have that much free time. She likes to hike, paddle, camp, curl, and read, in that order, I think. With that, we are going to move on. We're changing it up a little bit. We're going to talk a bit about some of the tools that we have and some of the activities, and then we're going to have Barb go in more in-depth in a few minutes. So with that, I'll let Sarah and Chris take this section over.
Yeah, so we are wrapped up for the end of this calendar year with Waters to the Sea Story webinars. We'll start again next calendar year with some new things. Look to see that from emails from us. If you'd like to receive continuing education units from this particular webinar, that will be in the follow-up email with the resources as well as the recording from tonight. All that stuff you can find on our CG website. Let's see. And then also we are hosting our virtual Mississippi River Delta Institute again this winter. So it's January and February, it's Tuesday nights. And I will be sending a registration link to that as well. It's just doing a deep dive on the Mississippi River from the headwaters to the Delta. We did this last year and the year before after pivoting from COVID, and it was a great success. So it's a nice thing to do kind of on a cold winter Tuesday and kind of get some collegiality going. But yeah, that's me. Chris?
Great. Yeah, so as Tracy and Sarah introduced me, my name is Chris Bennett, and my role is to get our K-12 resources out in the hands of teachers. So thank you, teachers and fans of teachers and friends of teachers out there for being here tonight. Our initiative right now that we're talking about is our Waters to the Sea, Explore the Shore. And so Barb's content will be a really in-depth look at one of the areas that's available on quite a few different resources around the state right now. So along the North Shore, we do have our multimedia gallery kiosks installed at quite a few breweries, hotels, visitor centers, state parks, and so on. So hopefully a lot of you have been out during the summer exploring our great kiosks. We do have a free Pocket Gallery smartphone app available right now. If you haven't downloaded that yet, you should definitely take a look. It has a lot of the same videos and content as the kiosks, but available on your phone. As Tracy mentioned earlier, some of the content that's just newly arrived on our kiosks is from our Northern Nights Starry Skies documentary that's just gone live with WDSE. And then my role in particular is to make all the teachers out there aware of our free online program. So the Lake Superior Odyssey is available online for students and teachers. It can be accessed through the email Sarah will send you, as well as in the chat. We'll throw it in the chat, as well as through our website. So if you forget everything else, go to Hamline University's Center for Global Environmental Education and look for our K-12 resources. The Waters to the Sea Lake Superior is live. And I just want to give you a quick tour and tell you how some of the content really would be a great follow-up to what you learned tonight from Barb. So overall, we have 20 different content areas. Each one of these icons links to videos, photos, interactives about northern skies, the night sky, Minnesota's wild shore, general Lake Superior introductory content, rivers and watersheds, and so on. As you scroll through here, what we're diving into tonight, as you know, it's the St. Louis River estuary. And so when you do have some time at home, what I encourage you to do is click around this interactive. Each one of these, whether you scroll through the bottom or you scroll through the map, includes a short 3 to 5 minute video about a topic that you'll hear more about tonight. So this is a short video about the history of the estuary, different things that have happened along the way to help restore it. This was put out by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. There's short videos here about the Interstate Island Restoration Project. And if you're a fan of the bird population and you'd like to learn more, I recommend this video right here. Great video about Barker's Island restoration. We have a video about the Wisconsin Point Dunes. As you get up into the estuary further, talking about the established estuary water trail. And then digging around a little bit deeper, we have quite a few videos about Spirit Island, wild rice, the importance of wild rice, and the restoration efforts towards wild rice that have been going on over the past few years. So this is all under the content block called St. Louis River Estuary. So I encourage you all to take a deep dive into there and share this resource again with any teacher friends you have, whether you're in the Duluth area along the North Shore or really anywhere else in the country. And then if you are interested in sharing some action items, Barb's talking a lot about land restoration and cleanup. And if you have family, friends, students, whatever, that are interested in doing some sort of action to protect our waterways, one place you can go is into our stewardship section right here. And this will connect you to the Adopt a Drain program, both our online interactives, as well as a link to the live website. So you can become a participant in adopting a drain in your community. You can do this anywhere in the state. Duluth is our newest city fully on board. However, they just went live a few weeks ago. They have 50 new adopters. So if you're in the Duluth area, again, start looking for the signs and the people out cleaning up and adopting drains. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Barb to share some more content.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to get set up here. All right, is everybody seeing my full screen? All right, well, thank you for having me tonight. It's really great to be with people who are interested in the St. Louis River and the Area of Concern program. For those of you who have not been to Duluth before and have not seen the estuary, it's this portion that goes on upstream through the St. Louis River. This is Superior, Wisconsin, and this is Duluth. So basically this photo is looking west. I think it's important to start out to make sure that people know what an estuary is. And simply an estuary is a place where waters meet and mix. So the water flowing downstream through the St. Louis River comes into this broader area that's the estuary. And when we have northeasterly winds, the winds push water from Lake Superior into the estuary, and it actually flows all the way up to here through a seiche event. So this whole area is a big mixing bowl, which is really important to the diversity of the estuary. And its importance is just very extensive. First of all, we're doing this area of concern work because we feel that this estuary is very important, not only locally, but regionally. It's the productivity driver for a lot of the fish that live in Western Lake Superior. There are over 230 bird species that have been documented in the estuary. And this area has been designated by Audubon as an important bird area because it's also a very important migratory corridor. And it's really the nursery for about 40 native fish species that are found in Western Lake Superior. So just biologically, it's very important. Also, it is a place where the indigenous people have come for decades and decades to find food. The Ojibwe migrated here to find the food that grows on water. So manumin or wild rice is quite important. And also, there's been some work done to estimate the natural capital value for the St. Louis River estuary that was done by the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, EPA, and Earth Economics. And they determined that the range of value for all of these natural resources here is between $14.6 and $38 million a year. So it's really an important place. And unfortunately, that sense of importance hasn't always been historically known. And if you've been to Duluth, you've probably passed over the lift bridge, and that's the Duluth entry. And the Duluth entry here is not a natural entry. It was dug back in 1871. And when that opened up, it allowed entry all the way back into the estuary. And you can see quickly how it modified the landscape, where wetlands were either dug out to create slips where the ships would dock, or it was filled to create land for the docks adjacent to the slips. And so that was just a huge modification of habitat. And it's been estimated that about 3,400 acres of shallow open water aquatic habitat was destroyed through that process. And once the estuary was opened up to all that shipping traffic, there was a lot of industry that moved in, and both industrial waste and municipal waste used to be discharged directly to the river without any sort of treatment. And here's a list of some of the major types of industries that were here at that time. And I think it's important to remember that when that discharge was happening, it was really done with an out of sight, out of mind attitude. When you dump something into a river, it typically flows downstream and then it's no longer in your backyard. So people didn't really understand the consequences of the dumping. They didn't understand the value of the wetlands. They didn't realize that some of that contamination would settle into the sediment and stay there for over 100 years. And so those are the unintended consequences that we're living with because of that ignorance. So as a result of these significant environmental damages that happened as a result of local impacts, the St. Louis River was named one of 43 areas of concern within the Great Lakes. We're the second largest in the United States, and we're one of 31, and we're also a bi-state area of concern. We are encompassing areas both in Minnesota and Wisconsin because the St. Louis River forms the border between our two states. So this listing happened in 1987. And I think it's important to note that throughout the Great Lakes, these kinds of impacts happened when there was kind of an industrial peak. And when that peak busted, there was a whole series of Rust Belt communities that were left behind. And so one of the reasons the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was passed as a binational effort was to help the Great Lakes communities recover both environmentally and economically. A little bit about how we're structured. So within the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, they've identified what they call beneficial use impairments, or we call them BUIs. And these impairments are different than the type of impairments that exist under today's Clean Water Act. So our removal, our designation of beneficial use impairments is completely different than the designation of impairments under the Clean Water Act. And there were 14 of them listed in the Great Lakes Water Quality Act, and through a lot of work in the early days, 9 of those were determined to be an issue here in the St. Louis River. And when they started doing that analysis, once they had identified what the impairments were, then they went through a process to figure out what were the targets to correct those problems and what type of actions would be needed to make those corrections. So this is a process that has been in place for us since 2013, and we began removing our beneficial use impairments back in 2014. So the first one to go was aesthetics. The next one to go be removed was our fish tumors and deformities, followed by our excess sediments and nutrients BUI. And right now, sitting in the hot hands of the EPA staff is our Fish and Wildlife Populations BUI removal package, and we hope to get their approval of its removal by the end of this year. So this structure is really important, and as we go through this presentation, we're going to continue to talk about every one of those BUIs. And note that all the rest of the removals are sometime in the 2027 or later timeframe, and there's a reason for that. All of the remaining ones are completely dependent on removing our restrictions to dredging BUI, as well as our loss of fish and wildlife habitat. So this bucket is all of our contaminated sediment site remediation projects, and this bucket is all of our habitat restoration projects. And as soon as we finish those, then we'll be able to also remove our beach closings and body contact restrictions BUI. But then we'll have to wait some unknown period of time to see how much recovery is needed before we can remove our degradation of benthos. And for those that don't know, benthos is the bottom dwelling bugs and vegetation that form the bottom of the food chain. And then we'll also have a recovery period of some unknown time before we can remove our restrictions on fish and wildlife consumption. So all of the remaining BUIs are interdependent, and we can't move forward with them until we get our construction projects done. So hopefully we'll get all the removals done by 2029 so that we can delist in 2030. That's our current goal. So this has been a long, long process. As I mentioned, the AOC was listed in 1987, and it took until 1992 before the impairments were evaluated and the 9 were identified here. In 1995, the initial set of actions were recommended. And so those were our 2 first remedial action plans. And another important planning effort was the completion of a habitat plan. And that plan took a really holistic look at the habitats in this area, had identified what the habitat issues were, and then set priorities for habitat restoration, from which we selected the projects that we're doing. It's important to know that in this timeline, in 2006 was when the Great Lakes Legacy Act was passed. That's a federal law that provided for contaminated sediment site cleanups. And that was later followed by the 2010 Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which then became the umbrella for the Great Lakes Legacy Act work. So all the funding now falls through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So there wasn't much progress in terms of project completion before 2010 because there had not been the federal funding that supported it. So following on in 2011, the removal targets were written, and then over the next 2 years, this complete remedial action plan that identified, here we have one AOC to delist. We know we have 9 BUIs to remove. And over time, we've come up with 80 different management actions spread across these BUIs that need to be completed before we can remove these BUIs and then delist the AOC. So this remedial action plan is something that we update every single year. It's an adaptive management plan. So if we see that something isn't working or we need to do additional work in another area, other projects can be proposed. But for the last several years, we've been stable at 80 management actions. This is a guidance document. This is not an enforcement program. This is completely voluntary. However, it has a really good incentive of getting a lot of federal money to do this work. And I'll talk about funding a little later. So I already mentioned we're the second largest AOC, and that's because the geographic area of the AOC is this big gray blob right here. But most of our work is concentrated in the estuary. So yeah, here's where the canal is and the lift bridge. This is the shipping harbor, and shipping continues all the way down into here. But our projects are all the way up and even farther up toward Cloquet and Scanlon. And then of course we have projects both in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. And this color scheme is just identifying the difference between our contaminated sediment projects that are still in progress. Here's a habitat project that's in progress. And all of these little purple ones are projects that have been completed. So our work is primarily in this area, which is the lower 39 miles, which is the primary zone of influence of the Seiche and that mixing within the estuary. We have many, many, many people involved in this work, and they all provide work support in different ways. Right now, because we're at the implementation stage, these are the primary entities that are involved. We have 4 coordinating agencies. One is with the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the Department of Natural Resources for Minnesota, and the Department of Natural Resources for Wisconsin. So each of these 4 coordinating agencies has a person that works in my capacity. Then we also have a lot of other federal and local agencies that are also providing administrative, technical, and outreach support. And I think people would recognize the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, excuse me, U.S. Geological Survey. Those are all federal agencies. And locally, the St. Louis River Alliance is our designated Citizen Action Committee. Every single AOC has a Citizens Action Committee, and their job is to bridge the work between the agencies and the community. And then the Minnesota Land Trust has been like the right arm of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, helping to implement restoration projects. And I'd also like to note that the public is a key stakeholder here, because without their involvement, these goals would never have been set in the first place. So there's public involvement through the St. Louis River Alliance. We also have many, many public input opportunities throughout this process. We have public meetings and comment periods and community events. We do presentations, and we've done a couple of stakeholder surveys through the years. So we try to stay quite engaged with our citizenry. And we use many, many different ways to connect with people. And one of those ways is the production of fact sheets and story maps and websites. And Sarah will be putting links to those things in the chat. And when she sends out the recording, she'll send you a copy of our current fact sheet. So this is a long and arduous process. I'm going to talk right now for several slides about our contaminated sediment sites, or our remediation sites. They're the ones we need to apply remedies to. And it really follows the Superfund model of how we address these sites. So it's a very rigorous process that's designed to provide the most effective solution, not the cheapest solution, the most cost-effective solution that gets us to meet our project goals. So the steps of this process include site assessment and selection. So way back in the beginning, millions of data points were collected of chemical, biological, and physical data throughout the estuary. And that chemistry data was particularly important to identify where we would need to do these remedial projects. When we got to that stage, then for each project, we do a remedial investigation to further characterize the site. That's followed by a feasibility study that looks at different options for what can be done. So here's a graphic that, for instance, shows the options that were considered for Minnesota Slip, where the William Irvin ship sits. And once that step is completed, then there's a stakeholder engagement opportunity for people to review those alternatives and weigh in on our decision. And then the remedial alternative is selected. And then we get to start the design process. And within the design process, we're developing the engineering specifications and plans to do the work. And we are also doing our environmental review, our cultural review, and all the permitting and the contracting work. And then once the contract is let, that's when the construction can begin. And because we're in Duluth, we have a 4-month construction period. We can't start until July, when the fish spawning season is over. And we typically are done by the end of October, when ice starts setting in. So many of these projects happen over multiple seasons because our seasons are short. And then once they're done, depending upon the type of remedy, we move into a monitoring and maintenance period. So in any given year, we've got different projects that are at different points in this process. So we have 16 different contaminated sediment projects here, and they fall into different categories by the type of remedy. We have 3 sites that, after doing our remedial investigation, we found that the health risk to humans and the environment was not significant. And so we did not need to take further action. We have several sites where we've applied remedial caps, others where we're actually dredging out and removing the contaminated sediment and putting it into landfills. At 2 sites, we're applying a carbon amendment, and at 2 very large and complex sites, we're using multiple approaches. So the selected remedy, it depends on the site's physical characteristics, the situation with the contamination, and what the health and environmental risks are, as well as the future uses. And I'll talk more about each of these types. So with remedial capping, we have to be very clear about what the future industrial or commercial use of a site is, because that will dictate the remedy. For instance, at the slips, we have to maintain vessel depth for ships to continue to utilize the harbor. And because in the slips, there are a lot of failing dock walls, we're limited. We cannot dredge material and remove it, or it would cause a collapse of those walls. And also the contamination is found at deeper depths in those areas, so it doesn't make it very cost effective to remove things. Plus, the concentration of the contaminants were much lower there, and they were more localized, and they tended to be contaminants that were not bioaccumulative. So an easy and cheaper, I use that term in quotes, solution was to place a remedial cap. So typically a site would be leveled, and then a layer of clean sand would be brought in, and then an armor stone layer on top of that would be applied to protect the cap itself. And the depth of the cap also varies, and that's site dependent. But the principle behind a remedial cap is that it creates a barrier between the contamination and where living organisms are, so that you're basically eliminating the exposure pathway so that organisms can no longer take up the contaminants. And so that addresses the ecological need as well as the need to continue to support the harbor. Here's some specific examples of where we did caps in all 4 of these slips. And you can see that we had a handful of contaminants at each of these slips. And we removed a lot of, or we capped a lot of contaminated sediment at these sites. And you can think about this in the context of one dump truck typically holds about 10 cubic yards. So that's about 20,000 truckloads of contaminated sediment that have been left in place and capped. But of that, there was a small amount that was all actually dredged out and disposed on site. And at every one of these sites, we encounter various types of debris that has to be removed and disposed off site. And then we, once that's done and we place the clean cover, that cover comes from the navigation channel. And we strategically identify the engineering specifications that identify where that material can come from, and then it's dredged out of the navigation channel. But it has to be free of contaminants, and it must meet our specifications. So that's something that we pay for. It's material that we pay for. And then over 24,000 cubic yards of armor stone is protecting those caps from prop wash primarily, but also wave action. And I should mention there were 2 other private slips that were remediated by private parties. One was adjacent to the Pier B resort, and the other is one of the Duluth Seaway Port Authority slips. So our next type of solution is dredging and removal with offsite disposal. This tends to happen primarily in backwater bays where we have higher concentrations of contaminants. And so they're places where there's a higher human health or environmental risk. And because we don't have those same infrastructure constraints, we don't have to worry about a dock wall collapsing, so we can do dredging here. And typically in these backwater bays, we find the contaminants dispersed across a larger area and also at varied depths. And then the other piece that's important about this is because once we remove the contaminated sediment from these areas, we have an opportunity to improve the aquatic habitat, which in these shallow backwater areas are very important fish spawning areas. And then I can give a couple of examples of where we've done this work, both at the ponds behind Erie Pier site and at Munger Landing. And again, a handful of contaminants have been removed. We've taken a lot of sediment out. These are both projects that are still in process. And something that's kind of unique about this dredging process is that once you take that sloppy sediment out of the bottom of the bay, you have to bring it someplace to get it to dewater. And so it gets pumped into these geotubes. And while it's in these geotubes, it settles out and the water is collected. And you can pretty much see in this little corner a mobile wastewater treatment system, because as that contaminated sediment is dewatering, that liquid has to be treated before it can be returned to the site. And then these materials in this particular location sit over the winter and dewater across the entire winter. And then next spring we'll come back in and take them out and haul the remaining material to the landfill for final disposal. And also at these sites, we place clean cover. And that clean cover is really important because it helps the benthic community of the macroinvertebrates and the macrophytes get reestablished. And it also helps reestablish different types of habitat, both stream habitats in some locations, wetlands in all our locations, and fish spawning areas are also targets. I would also mention that Munger Landing, which is this middle picture here, this is the only site where we had high levels of PCB that were considered to be at hazardous waste levels. So that material, about 750 cubic yards, is going to get shipped to a hazardous waste landfill in Indiana. So that's something that's unique about Munger Landing is we're getting some federal support for installing an ADA compliant kayak launch up over in this area, and then we'll restore the boat landing here. So typically amenities aren't part of this work. And then our third application for contaminated sediments is activated carbon application. So we're doing it in 2 reservoirs because those reservoirs are active power generation reservoirs. Their size, geology, and water depth prevent us from doing either capping or dredging at those locations. And because the contaminant of concern is dioxins and furans, that material is able to be adsorbed onto the carbon, so it takes it out of the food chain and it stops cycling it through the environment. So that's the way that it addresses the contamination. And believe it or not, this is a very precise application of material. And we went through a year of pilot testing before we started this process in order to make sure that it would work. Here, the U.S. Steel Spirit Lake site is one where we've used very many remedies, as well as it's a significant habitat restoration site. So you can see by the color, the yellow areas here are the ones where they did dredge and removal. Here, there was dredging, removal, and cap material applied. Here, just a remedial cap was applied. In these 2 areas, we're enhancing the natural recovery by adding material at the base of these polygons. These 2 blue areas are confined disposal facilities. So material that was taken out here, for instance, has been applied here. This one happens to be geotubes as well, but instead of landfilling it someplace else, it's been capped and will remain in place forever. There's an upland cap that was applied here, and these dark blue areas we just will monitor for natural recovery over time. And in this little area, we just had to do some grading and capping. And out of this entire area, we'll end up with 138 acres of aquatic habitat and a number of recreational amenities. And this site is unique in that it is listed on Minnesota's Superfund list, but the aquatic units were removed from that work, and so that made them eligible for the Great Lakes Legacy Act funding. And so it's co-funded by U.S. Steel, and they're paying half the cost of this $186 million project. Another thing we have spent a lot of time on is data management. We have both a federal database that we use, the Great Lakes Diver program, but we're also replicating that data within MPCA's own database, so it's available to be merged with other state data that's collected. There's a lot of effort that goes into the QA/QC process to make sure our data is accurate, and then it's also accessible to others. And within our agency, we also export our data to a tool called Tableau, which enables us to visualize that data so you can see where it's located spatially and in depth as well. On the habitat side, we're restoring projects. We have many goals across the top here of things that we want to achieve with our habitat restoration projects. Not all needs fit every single project. These are the ones that are already completed, but the various needs for each project have to be identified on a site-specific basis. So it all depends on the site's history, what the desired conditions are, what the contaminant levels are, and what the long-range habitat goals are. And we tend to lump our techniques into these buckets. We've got several dune projects where we're restoring the beach dunes. Most of our work is building underwater habitat, just like with our contaminated sediment sites, so that when you see a project before we start work, it looks exactly the same as how it looks after we've done our underwater work. We have several stream areas that we're stabilizing. We're seeding wild rice throughout the entire estuary. We're improving fish passage in a couple of locations, and we have a couple locations where we have legacy wood waste from the sawmills. This is an example of something that we call a remediation to restoration project. And in these sites, there are low levels of contamination that we basically cap with the creation of an underwater shoal that also creates shallow sheltered bay habitat, which is one of the main habitat types that was lost. So in this particular location, these orange blobs are the shoals that we built. And back in 2020, we covered this shoal and half of this shoal with natural biomedium, clean muck from the bottom of Kingsbury Bay, which was another habitat project. And then we came back this year, and on the shoals that we had not topped yet, we manufactured biomedium using clean sand and 8 species of aquatic plants to create an artificial biomedium on these. So when we're all done, we'll be able to compare the performance of those 2 different types of biomedia in seeing how well they performed. This is an example of one project that's going on right now, where it's managed by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. It's called Perch Lake. This used to be a backwater bay of the St. Louis River. It was cut off by Highway 23 and the railroad. So over time, it just filled with sediment and then allowed a lot of cattails to grow. So one of the goals of this project was to create depth diversity. So 60,000 cubic yards of material has been taken out of this area. And then we also have gone in and constructed channels here within the existing wetlands to create something called hemimarsh habitat. And hemimarsh is about 50-50 plants and water, and it's particularly important for aquatic and riparian bird species. And then spawning habitat was also a goal of the work within the main part of the lake. Next year, we're coming back in, and we will be doing a culvert installation here, and the purpose of that is to restore some circulation between the river and the lake. Right now, we have just one tiny little inlet under here that you can't see, so we're really hoping for better water circulation through there. Another one that we're just in the early part of the design stage is Mud Lake. And because we're in the pre-design stage, what we're doing is we're collecting data that's going to be used to help us inform our design. This is the last of the habitat projects that Minnesota is doing under the AOC program, but there will be continued future habitat work here done under other programs for many, many years, I think. The data that's collected helps us determine the design alternatives that we'll pursue here. And the goals for this particular site are the same as for Perch Lake. We want to create depth diversity. We want to make sure that we've got hydraulic connectivity between the river and the rest of the lake, which we don't have right now. There's virtually no circulation. And we also want to restore both hemimarshes and coastal marsh habitat. So we're hoping construction will start at this site in 2024, and we expect it to take 2 years. Another really important bi-state habitat restoration project is Manuman seeding. So our plan is to seed over 275 acres in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. Right now we're at about 260 acres. We've been doing this work since 2015. So every single year we have to go in and prepare the sites, broadcast the seed. We monitor the density and acreage goals for our different seeding areas, and we control geese herbivory. So that's geese eating the seeds, which will have a really terrific wild rice production. It'll get up to the floating leaf stage, and as soon as it pops up with the seeds, the geese are able to find it. So we're experimenting with exclosures to keep the geese out, and also geese roundups. So this is an example for this year where we had collected and applied over 8,000 pounds of rice over 58 acres. And you can see that the seeding rate was different for every one of these sites. So from year to year, it's different. Last year during the drought, we seeded, I think, all of 60 pounds. So it was really important for us to get a good year this year. Right now, I'm going to kind of switch and talk about the beneficial use impairments that we've already removed. As I mentioned in our one of the first slides, that we've removed 3 of them. One of them was our degradation of aesthetics BUI, which was removed in 2014. This was resolving issues like oil slicks and chemical and tar residues and taconite pellets that were found on the shoreline, and rotting grain scum and obnoxious odors. And that was one of the first things that was addressed. We also removed our fish tumors and other deformities BUI. It was hypothesized early on that because of the contamination, we must have higher levels of fish tumors and deformities here, but there was no documentation of that. So the studies that were done were to determine how fish tumor rates, what they were within the estuary as compared to reference sites. And we found that there was no significant difference. So we were able to remove that one. We were also able to remove our excessive loading of sediment and nutrients BUI. We weren't sure what the status was early on. We knew that as soon as the wastewater treatment plant was built here in Duluth and upgraded and Superior, water quality started to improve, but there had been no assessment of water quality data over time to see if we were on a trajectory for continued water quality improvements. And the data that was collected showed that to be true. This group of people are pulling up sediment cores that they did paleolimnological studies on to determine what the more ancient conditions were in the estuary. So we demonstrated that nutrients and sediments here weren't impairing water quality or habitat or restricting recreation. So we were able to remove that one as well. The degraded fish and wildlife populations is the one that's we're working on removing right now. Similarly, we didn't have much early data, so a lot of the initial work was gathering data and determining what the status of those populations were. We knew that the loss of physical habitat and the pollution and the invasive species competition was impacting those populations. So target species were identified, and then an assessment of those populations was completed. And from that, 2 habitat projects were done, restoring piping plover nesting habitat on Wisconsin Point, and then also improving the common tern habitat at Interstate Island. And then we also had to do an additional assessment of sturgeon tissues to confirm that legacy contaminants were not impeding their recovery, which they weren't. So we were able to move forward with this removal. I've already talked about these 2 removals. They're the ones that are related here to our contaminated sediment projects as well as our habitat projects. And as soon as those are done, we'll be able to submit those removal packages for approval. We hope to have our projects done by 2026 so that we can remove it in 2027. And then on the heels of that, we will be able to remove our beach closings and body contact restrictions BUI. On this one, we've got 3 different construction projects that have either no swimming signs posted or warning signs. And until we deal with the contamination, those can't be removed. And once that's done, then we just will need to document the compliance status for our wastewater treatment permits and our stormwater discharge permits, and we can proceed with that one. Then we have 2 others that are going to take a little longer, and one of them is the fish consumption advisories. This is really a complicated story and would take an entire presentation separate from this to talk about what we've learned. But in short, we know now that mercury in the environment is coming partially from the legacy sources, but partially through discharge from waterways and precipitation onto the land. And our AOC program is only responsible for those legacy sources. So we know that fish consumption advisories, particularly for mercury, are likely to still be in effect after we're done. But we expect to see the PCB concentrations in fish tissue decline as we get our projects completed. So the other thing we're learning is that the total mercury transforms into methylmercury, and that's the form that is taken up by organisms. And so we're trying to figure out how much of that methylmercury comes from legacy mercury and actually gets converted and contributes to the fish consumption advisory. So stay tuned on that one. And then our last BUI is our degraded benthos. So we've got our macroinvertebrates, the bugs, and our macrophytes, that's the vegetation that's referred to here. We collected samples of each at every single project location before construction started. We'll go back after construction is completed and we'll compare, and hopefully we'll be seeing improvements in that. We have 4 of 14 of our sites completely assessed, but I think you can see by the dispersal of sampling locations that our estuary is quite well studied, and we feel really confident that we'll be able to establish recovery trends through this process. And this is just an example of how we're using spatial information to show recovery, in addition to using something that's called the trimetric index, that those are calculated scores that we'll be able to compare site to site. So right now we have 63.8% of our management actions complete. Still have several years to go, but we're definitely over the hill, I think. And the other big piece of this story is funding. As you can see from the list, we are exhausting every single funding source possible to fund this work. And once funds are awarded to us, they're earmarked for very specific projects and cannot be used elsewhere. And we've gone through an assessment for just our remediation and restoration projects, just in Minnesota, and just those under the AOC program. And we're looking at a price tag of about $467 million. And one thing I want to note, a couple things from this chart, that the public investment from the federal side, the $195 million from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, is almost equal to the private contribution that's been made. And that here in the Clean Water Land and Legacy Act that we get through our sales tax in Minnesota, that has helped us through both the Outdoor Heritage Fund and the Clean Water Fund. And we've had an infusion of Minnesota bonds to pay our share on our contaminated sediment projects. And already we are seeing signs that this cleanup is catalyzing both development and recreation in the estuary. This is the Pier B resort site that was built once they knew that there was going to be this cleaned up waterfront that they could take advantage of. And then within, I think, a year and a half ago or so, the St. Louis River estuary has now got a designated national water trail system that's attracting quite a lot of interest. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Tracy so that he can moderate questions.
Well, first, a round of applause, virtual applause, for an incredible story. There is so much to unpack in that, and thank you for taking a crack at sharing that. It is just a massive amount of work that's been done. So certainly, please put your questions, if you have some, into the question and answer location. I actually have a few that we can get started with. One of the questions that you mentioned was 4.67 million from Minnesota from the AOC. What would you say, you know, the Wisconsin side, or I mean, that's just part of the story. So what might a total amount be? It's got to be a fairly large number.
You know, Wisconsin has not gone through this exercise to tally what their costs have been. They're much earlier in the process on many of their contaminated sediment site projects, so they don't even have estimates for what those costs are. When you get the fact sheet, it will show every one of our Minnesota projects, what the goals are for each of the projects and what the estimated cost is and the funding sources. So it's quite a complicated puzzle to put together, and I couldn't even begin to guess what Wisconsin's is. And this does not include funding that we've gotten to support staff. It doesn't include staff salaries, either federal staff or us. So, you know, $1 billion. I'll throw a target out, $1 billion.
That's an incredible investment. I'm proud that is happening here, which kind of brings up another question that I had is, it sounds like Minnesota is taking a strong leadership role in this. I'm not saying Wisconsin's not doing as good, but it seems we're a little more advanced. How does this compare to other initiatives in the Great Lakes? Is this, I know it was the second largest AOC, so is the other one having more resources put in, or how does this compare to other initiatives, which I'm sure you all get together and share information?
Yeah, I have a little bit of knowledge in that front. First of all, I'd say Wisconsin doesn't have as many contaminated sediment sites as we do, because there's more of the industry came to the Minnesota side when the Duluth Ship Canal was built.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have as many contaminated sites to deal with. First of all, they've spent more of their money on habitat restoration on some really large projects. And they were kind of ahead of the game in terms of doing habitat work even before the AOC was listed. So they didn't have to have as many projects. Regarding our situation here, I mean, I can remember going to one AOC conference and hearing from the Ohio EPA the conditions in the Cuyahoga AOC. And if you remember the Cuyahoga fires that prompted the Clean Water Act, their areas were just filthy. I mean, I would drink our water compared to their water in comparison. So even though we have contamination issues, we are not even close to being the most severe problems across the Great Lakes.
Got it. I'm going to keep throwing out a few questions. If folks will have some, please put those in. I'm not seeing any come in, but I have a few more. How is the current, I mean, where a lot of this is looking back, you talked about the present. What does the future look like? Is the shipping industry? How is industries now that are still important to the economy? How are they interacting, and what steps are they taking, and are they active partners in preventing future problems?
Oh, well, thankfully, we have the Clean Water Act in place and have had it in place since 1972. So all of those industrial sites have to have industrial stormwater permits. Some of them have to have wastewater permits, depending upon the work that they're doing. But if you take a drive sometime around our port and look at the different slips, you'll see that for an industrial area, it's pretty well kept. Mm-hmm. And I think they have as much value in our water resources as anybody else that lives here. And they work really hard to be a green harbor, and the Duluth Seaway Port Authority helps support that. They've been an active partner from the beginning. We work closely with them because we want to maintain the shipping services of the harbor as we're doing our work. So that's taken a lot of coordination and cooperation. So I would say the things that you might have seen in the 70s are not what you see today in terms of operations.
Fantastic. I know there's been a great deal of community effort, and you had a great listing of agencies, state and local, and a lot of federal. Can you give a shout out to any of the, I know there were some stories of the lake. I know there was good movement, good storytelling happening. Is there anything in particular that should be or could be recognized at this point of the average citizen or storytelling?
Well, I think one of the things that I found interesting when I started and was trying to unpack what had happened was the amount of community interest in the very early planning stages through the preparation of the first 3 remedial action plans between 1992 and 2013. Over 70 organizations were involved. So there was just tremendous involvement, both of citizens and organizations, to make sure they had a voice in what the plan would look like for how we would make the estuary recover.
Wow, that's impressive. A couple more questions that I have, and then if somebody has any, please throw them out. But in this restoration process, I mean, you've had an interesting career. What is one of the things that you've learned in the, I guess, 4 or 5 year, going on 5 years, as a takeaway to that has made this successful, and maybe an aha takeaway moment?
Oh, that's putting me on the spot, Tracy.
Yep. Oh yeah.
I, I think one of the things that's been most impressive to me is that when you're working at this geographic scale across so many different organizations with so many problems and so many monetary needs, it's just takes constant effort and coordination to keep people moving along together. And the degree of cooperation here is phenomenal. And the perseverance of all of these organizations has been remarkable because you don't get to you say, oh, we're going to do this project and then do it the next year. It takes 10 years of ramping up before you can do something that may take 1 to 4 years of construction. With the U.S. Steel Spirit Lake site, they started having conversations about whether or not they could even incorporate a portion of that work under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and that took almost a decade. And the construction at that site, the logistics of it have been unbelievable, and they're getting this work done in 4 years, which is remarkable. Had that been left under the Superfund program, we'd be in court for an equal amount of time, I'm sure.
All right, a couple of questions have come through. One, I think it's kind of tied to that. How has previous experience helped you manage this project? And I might say, how has been a science teacher for 7 years? Has that helped in pulling this together? So that's a question.
Well, I guess you'll have to be the judge of that based on what you learned from me tonight and how much of it you can retain. I think that the I would call it classroom management. If you've ever been a classroom teacher, you know what it takes to manage, 30 students and keep them moving along at roughly the same pace so that everybody gets what they need out of that classroom experience. This is a lot the same, where you're managing, 30 different entities at one time, trying to keep them on the same pace, taking care of little fights that break out, in different corners of the room. Yeah, life is just one big classroom, right?
Exactly. All right, a couple more questions here. This is from Bernadette. We do see profound water degradation along the line 3. Restoration is wonderful. Preventing pollution and destruction is the future. Could you please speak to this?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that we're doing that's not a requirement, and I should mention that the whole AOC program is completely voluntary. It is not an enforcement program. So as I mentioned before, having this money coming in is our incentive to keep doing the work. But one of the things I feel we need to do that's not a requirement of the program is to embed these stories into the community so people never forget that we made these mistakes. This is the investment that was needed to correct them. Let's not repeat that mistake ever again. And thankfully, we have better controls. They're not perfect, but we do have better controls through our federal and state regulations that help prevent those kind of things from happening. But you're absolutely right. Pollution prevention is where it's at.
Excellent. Well, this is getting near the final question. This is from Tom. Could you talk about the environmental justice aspects of this work? Are there initiatives to ensure these efforts are equitable? What should we be doing differently or with more intention in this regard?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is that if you remember the map, most of this work is being done in the estuary in West Duluth, which is the area of town that suffers the most economic disparities. So just by virtue of cleaning up these areas makes those neighborhoods more inviting. So hopefully that will continue to draw more resources to revitalize those neighborhoods. Secondly, Manoomin is a huge cultural of huge cultural importance to the Fond du Lac band. That's part of their origin story and why they migrated here. And so restoration of harvestable stands of wild rice is quite important to them. And thirdly, we know that just because we've done the work of either restoring habitat or cleaning up contaminated sites, that's not enough. We have to find a way to help neighborhoods that are in proximity to those locations learn that they're there, learn what they can do there, and that these are now recreational assets for their neighborhood, and help them overcome the barriers to using them, teach them to paddle, teach them to swim, help them learn how to get to those sites, pair them up with a birder so that they can really come to appreciate now what's in their neighborhood. So those are all things that are kind of in the works.
All right. We do have another question here. I think this will be the final one. Amazing work. I agree with that statement. From Jake's has an interesting question. Thousands of truckloads of sediment excavated and removed made me wonder how much pollution was generated from to do this work. Is this carbon emissions, methane release, etc., tracked, estimated, or factored into the decisions when this kind of work is proposed and done?
It is not, but I would say that we do as much as we can to not truck anything anywhere. So for instance, at our Munger Landing project site, as that sediment is hydraulically dredged, it is pumped through a pipe for 3 miles to Hallett Dock 7, which is where our processing site is, where we're putting the material into the geotubes and operating our wastewater treatment. If we weren't piping it hydraulically, we would have to truck it, and then we would have an issue of needing to dewater it on site before we could truck it, and it would make it much more cost prohibitive. So we do take those kind of things into account. We don't want to disturb neighborhoods more than we have to. We don't want to impact our road infrastructure more than we have to. And so all of those things play into the whole idea of reducing our carbon footprint as well.
Fantastic. Well, with that, there is 2 little things I'm going to do, and then we'll give this a full wrap. Always looking ahead. Our center is working with various folks up there, Tom from the EPA, Barb, other folks to tell a story. We're calling it a Sea Change Lake Superior. It will be a PBS documentary that we hope will be rolling out really about this time next year. So if all goes well, we'll cross our fingers, there'll be some more storytelling that looks at this, these multiple components, how they tie together through the lens, multiple lenses, a little bit like we had done for the Dark Skies and Starry Nights. That's an exciting component. And I have to give a shout out to some real crazy friends who are interested in doing some distance swimming. And I had them talk to Barb about when can they do these swims in the estuary, and that's under discussion. But next year, hopefully, they are going to do a 48-mile marathon over a 30-hour period to raise awareness for Lake Superior. So that's another thing that's happening. And what we see is with water taking a larger and larger role in environmental issues, I know a lot of folks are looking at Minnesota and the lake as